May 15, 1945, at 09:30 hours, Gluxburg Castle, located 3 kilometers north of Finnsburg, Germany. The morning was crisp and cool as Paul Nitser gazed out the castle windows towards the distant Finnsburg fjord, its waters serene despite the turmoil that had engulfed Europe for 6 years. Opposite him sat Albert Speer, a man who had kept Nazi Germany's war effort operational for 3 years amid relentless Allied bombing raids on every major industrial city within the Reich. At 40 years old, Speer appeared immaculate in his tailored suit, even though he was a prisoner of war. His hands were neatly folded on the table, and his posture was impeccable with no hint of defiance or swagger, only a calm, calculating demeanor could be seen in his eyes. Nitser, aged 38 and formerly an investment banker from Wall Street, had entered government service upon being summoned by his mentor James Forrestal to Washington in 1940. He now held the position of vice chairman at the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. His primary objective was a single crucial question, but before he could ask it, he needed Speer to trust him or at least believe that cooperation would serve his interests better than silence. The war in Europe had concluded just 8 days earlier on May 7th, when Germany officially surrendered unconditionally at Reims, France. Adolf Hitler had committed suicide in his Berlin bunker on April 30th as Soviet artillery rained down outside. Following the dictator's death, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, designated successor by Hitler, established a so-called government in Flensburg, but it was merely a facade. Germany ceased to exist as an independent nation. It lay in ruins, and now the question arose of what lessons could be gleaned from examining this fallen state before its adversaries divided up the remaining pieces. American troops had arrived in Flensburg on May 15th. The race to interrogate Speer was over, with Nitser arriving first. The United Nations War Crimes Commission sought to have him tried alongside Go, Ring, and other Nazi leaders once he was in chains, but Nitser needed him to talk first. Despite the ongoing Pacific War and American bombers systematically targeting Japanese cities such as Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya, there were doubts about whether strategic bombing alone could compel Japan's surrender without resorting to a devastating ground invasion. Invasion estimates predicted 500,000 American casualties or more, underscoring the importance of making strategic bombing succeed in forcing capitulation without a prolonged land battle. The Americans needed to understand what had worked against Germany and why. Only one man held the complete answer: Speer. Nitser had been pursuing this interrogation for weeks. Established in November 1944 by Secretary of War Henry Stimson at President Franklin Roosevelt's directive, the Strategic Bombing Survey aimed to determine the impact of strategic bombing on Germany's capacity to wage war and document both its successes and failures. Apply those insights gained in the Pacific theater. Nitser had put together an impressive team of experts. One of them was John Kenneth Galbraith, a future Harvard professor and best-selling author who was present during the discussions at Gluxburg. Another key figure was George Ball, who would later serve as Undersecretary of State during both the Kennedy and Johnson presidencies. Ball had spent months leading teams throughout Germany, assessing bombed-out factories, interviewing traumatized industrialists, and analyzing production records from sites that Allied bombs had turned to rubble. Speer, however, was the centerpiece of their efforts. He held the key to understanding all the interviews, documents, and damage assessments. Speer had overseen the entire German war economy since February 1942, when he took over as Minister of Armaments following the death of his predecessor, Fritz Todt, in a plane crash. For 3 years, Speer managed every factory, supply chain, and labor allocation decision from the Atlantic coast to the outskirts of Moscow. If anyone possessed knowledge about the effectiveness of strategic bombing, whether it had crippled German production or merely caused minor disruptions, it was Speer. The challenge lay in the fact that Speer understood his value. As he observed other Nazi leaders in the final days of the war, some chose suicide like Hitler and Goebbels, others fled and were being hunted down like animals, and still others were captured and prepared for trial at Nuremberg. Knowing these outcomes, Speer had carefully calculated his own survival chances. Unlike notorious figures such as Göring or Himmler, Speer's name wasn't as infamous. He hadn't made inflammatory speeches or overseen concentration camps. Instead, he was the technocratic architect who kept Germany fighting longer than expected through his production genius. By cooperating with the Americans and providing them with crucial information about strategic bombing, Speer hoped they might see him as indispensable and shield him from prosecution at Nuremberg. Perhaps they would tell the prosecutors that Speer had been cooperative, distinct from others, and instrumental in aiding the Allies by explaining both successes and failures of Germany's war effort. Speer took a deliberate gamble. After all, he knew how to weigh risks meticulously. He had formulated his approach well before Nitser posed her first question: complete cooperation and full disclosure. Speer intended to share every detail the Americans sought regarding German war production, the consequences of strategic bombing campaigns, Hitler's last days, and the disintegration of the Reich's economy. Except for one critical area that could result in execution, his involvement in and awareness of the Holocaust. This topic was off limits. Speer planned to maintain a facade of ignorance about the full extent of the atrocities taking place within the concentration camps, while acknowledging general responsibility for Germany's defeat. It would be a precarious balancing act, but he felt confident he could manage it. Nitser quickly grasped this strategy. He noticed Speer's posture stiffen and his demeanor shift whenever questions strayed towards moral or ethical issues compared to technical inquiries about production and bombing efficacy. Recognizing this pattern, Nitser opted for a tactical adjustment focusing on operational details rather than wartime atrocities. The conversation would revolve around factory operations instead of crimes against humanity, production figures over forced labor camps, and structural damage assessments rather than extermination facilities. His objective was to gather the data necessary for their study and leave discussions about war crimes to the judicial process at Nuremberg. For a week from May 15th through May 21st, Nitser and his team questioned Speer for 5 hours daily, occasionally extending sessions into the evening when Speer provided particularly insightful information or documents. Each morning, Speer arrived in his impeccably tailored suit, presenting himself as cooperative and forthcoming, sometimes even offering additional details beyond what was requested. Speer led them through what he referred to as bombing high school, educating conquerors on how a nation endures and ultimately succumbs under total air warfare. He began with the production data that had earned him renown within Nazi ranks for keeping the war machine operational. Upon assuming control of the armaments ministry in February 1942, Germany was producing around 15,000 aircraft annually. By 1944, the number of aircraft produced reached 39,8070 units. The manufacturing output for tanks and self-propelled artillery had risen from about 4,900 in 1941 to roughly 27,000 by 1944. Ammunition production also more than doubled during this period. Similar significant increases were observed in the production of artillery pieces, submarines, trucks, small arms, and other military equipment. This remarkable surge was dubbed the armament miracle. Speer's organizational brilliance is said to have prolonged Germany's involvement in the war beyond what economic fundamentals would suggest possible. Nitz listened intently while taking detailed notes, impressed by these figures yet perplexed by their implications. There seemed to be a fundamental inconsistency that required clarification. Germany had faced relentless Allied bombing since May 1942, when the Royal Air Force conducted its first 1,000-bomber raid on Cologne with unprecedented force. American daylight precision bombing commenced in August 1942, targeting rail yards in occupied France. By mid-1943, a continuous barrage of attacks from both RAF Bomber Command and U.S. Army air forces left German cities and industrial targets under assault around the clock. The British conducted night area raids aimed at destroying residential areas, killing workers, and undermining civilian morale. Meanwhile, American forces flew precision daylight missions against specific industrial facilities such as ball bearing plants, aircraft factories, synthetic oil refineries, rail yards, and submarine pens. Over the course of the war, tens of thousands of bombers dropped millions of tons of explosives on Germany, transforming cities like Hamburg and Dresden into scenes of devastation. Berlin lay in ruins. Despite this relentless onslaught, German production tripled under Speer's leadership. How was this possible? Nitser aimed to grasp the underlying process. How could an industrial economy subjected to relentless bombing boost its output by 300%? What strategies did Germany employ to sustain factory operations amid constant aerial assaults day and night? Speer provided a comprehensive explanation, delivering his lecture with the authority of an academic professor. Among these tactics was the dispersal of production facilities into smaller workshops spread throughout rural areas where bombers were less likely to locate them. Critical manufacturing units were relocated to underground sites such as converted mines and railway tunnels for added security. Resource allocation became fiercely prioritized, civilian goods production ceased entirely, freeing up materials and labor for military output. Redundancies in the supply chain ensured that if one factory was destroyed, others could ramp up their production to make up for the loss. German engineers devised more efficient industrial processes under the strain of continual bombing, simplifying aircraft and tank designs to reduce part count, streamline assembly, and expedite manufacturing. The regime also exploited forced labor from occupied territories, drafting millions of workers against their will to replace conscripted German men in the Wehrmacht. Speer presented these measures as logical solutions to logistical challenges, highlighting administrative expertise and organizational ingenuity. However, he omitted any reference to the harsh conditions faced by those coerced into working, such as starvation, beatings, and deaths occurring in factories and camps, instead focusing solely on output charts that demonstrated improvements. Yet there was one detail that caused Nitser to pause and look up from his notice, a specific date, May 12, 1944. Speer emphasized the significance of this day, noting that it marked when 935 American heavy bombers from the 8th Air Force struck German synthetic oil production facilities in central and eastern Germany, the largest such attack on petroleum infrastructure during the war until then. The primary target was the Lunar synthetic oil plant near Nuremberg, Germany's principal producer of aviation gasoline. Other significant plants at Litz near Stettin, Brüx occupied Czechoslovakia, Bohelen, Zeitz, and Luna also suffered substantial damage. Speer claimed that this attack drastically altered everything. Until May 12th, Germany had been able to manufacture enough weapons to meet the demands of its armed forces despite significant damage from Allied bombing raids. However, everything started falling apart after that date. The period of miraculous armament production came to an end. Although it would take another 11 months and hundreds of thousands more casualties before Germany capitulated, the war was essentially lost at this point. Nitser meticulously recorded these observations, recognizing them as a critical discovery. It wasn't about tanks, aircraft, ball bearings, or even oil. Rather, it was the lack of fuel that rendered every weapon system immobile and non-operational. Speer then elaborated on how things deteriorated further. Following the May attacks on German oil facilities, the country's monthly synthetic fuel production plummeted dramatically. In April 1944, Germany had managed to produce 16,000 tons of aviation gasoline and other petroleum products. By July, this figure had dropped to just 107,000 tons, and by September, it had fallen below 50,000 tons. The attacks persisted, with American heavy bombers repeatedly returning to strike the synthetic oil plants. Despite German workers' efforts to repair the damage and restart production, more bombers continued to arrive. These refineries became the most heavily defended targets in Germany, surrounded by anti-aircraft guns and protected by fighter squadrons diverted from other fronts. Yet none of these defenses could prevent further destruction. By December 1944, German fuel production had reached what Speer described as a catastrophic state. As a result, the Luftwaffe was grounded due to a lack of operational fuel. Pilot training, already critically reduced to perilously low hours, faced further restrictions due to insufficient fuel for maintaining flight operations of training aircraft. New fighter squadrons received their aircraft but remained grounded because of a lack of gasoline. Meanwhile, German jet fighters like the WWII-62, which were technologically advanced compared to any Allied fighter and produced in significant numbers, could not be deployed effectively due to the scarcity of fuel needed for pilot training and sustaining combat missions by operational squadrons. Panzer divisions were unable to move because commanders had to decide between allocating their limited fuel reserves for training exercises or reserving it for combat operations. Typically, they opted to conserve fuel, leading to tank crews entering battle with inadequate training, resulting in higher casualty rates and increased demand for replacement personnel who needed more training that required additional fuel that was unavailable. This created a vicious cycle. When Germany launched its last major offensive in the West, known as the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, German planners had only enough fuel to enable attacking divisions to reach their initial objectives. The operational plan explicitly relied on capturing Allied fuel depots to sustain the offensive beyond the first few days. However, when these fuel depots were not captured and American resistance was stronger than anticipated, entire panzer formations ran out of gasoline in the Ardennes forest and had to be abandoned by their crews. Thousands of tanks that had been meticulously constructed in dispersed factories, successfully transported to the front lines, equipped with functioning guns, and manned by trained crews, were rendered immobile due to a lack of fuel. Nitser requested more information about other bombing targets. What about the famous raids on Schweinfurt, the city responsible for producing most of Germany's ball bearings? American bombers conducted 2 attacks on Schweinfurt in 1943, suffering severe losses. The second raid on October 14th resulted in 60 bombers and 600 aircrew casualties for the 8th Air Force. Surely such a critical target would have crippled German production. Speer offered a slight smile, a practiced gesture akin to one a teacher might use when addressing an obvious question from a student. Ball bearings. Speer clarified that Germany had never been as vulnerable as the Americans thought. Prior to the bombings, Germany had amassed a substantial reserve of supplies. Even when production at Schweinfurt diminished, German engineers devised simpler alternatives for bearings in less demanding applications, using sleeve and plain bearings wherever possible to minimize ball bearing usage. They also secured imports from Sweden and Switzerland via supply routes that were still operational despite the Allied blockade. While these attacks did cause some loss of production capacity, they fell short of crippling Germany's capabilities. Meanwhile, the raids inflicted significant damage on American heavy bomber fleets and their seasoned crews. In Speer's view, Schweinfurt had ultimately benefited Germany more than it harmed them. What about targeting transportation networks? The railway system responsible for transporting raw materials to factories and finished weapons to the front became increasingly vulnerable in the later stages of the war. By February 1945, Eastern Germany's industrial heartland was completely cut off from its coal supply sources, leaving Finnish tanks unable to reach the Eastern Front and preventing raw materials from reaching manufacturing plants. However, Speer acknowledged that these transportation attacks only proved decisive at the end when Germany was already on the brink of defeat due largely to fuel shortages that made movement impossible even with intact rail lines. Regarding aircraft production facilities, Speer noted that despite continuous Allied bombing raids, German aircraft output reached a wartime peak in 1944, 39 80-70 planes. How could this be possible? According to Speer, the answer lay in dispersing factories and shifting production underground. The assembly process was divided into smaller tasks carried out in workshops that were hard to pinpoint. The Germans became highly efficient at manufacturing aircraft, but the issue wasn't production. Rather, it was the lack of fuel. As Speer pointed out, You can construct as many fighters as you like, but if you cannot supply them with fuel, train pilots to fly them, or transport them to operational airfields, they are rendered useless. In 1944, Germany produced thousands of aircraft that never saw combat due to a shortage of fuel and trained pilots. These planes remained idle on airfields or in factories because of the lack of oil and qualified personnel. Constructing an airplane took weeks, while training a pilot required months. Producing enough fuel to keep them flying demanded refinery capacity that had been devastated by Allied bombers. Nitser began to recognize this pattern. Strategic bombing had succeeded precisely where it mattered most, by targeting Germany's limited supply of oil, while Speer managed to find alternatives for other critical needs such as relocating factories, repairing equipment, using forced labor from occupied territories, and optimizing production methods. There was no substitute for the essential resource of oil. Germany possessed almost no natural petroleum reserves of its own. The Reich relied entirely on synthetic fuel facilities that transformed coal into gasoline and diesel via intricate chemical procedures. Once these plants were destroyed, there was no fallback option. Romania had supplied crude oil from the pesty fields until Soviet forces seized control of the country in August 1944. After this point, Germany operated solely on whatever synthetic fuel its damaged refineries could still manufacture, an output that dwindled with each bombing raid. On May 18th, during the third day of interrogation, Nitser changed the subject and inquired about American industrial capacity. He wanted to know what German leadership had understood regarding America's production capability prior to the war, what intelligence they possessed, and what they believed America could actually produce. This shift marked a critical moment in their conversation. It was here that Nitser began to grasp something more profound than just the impact of bombing effectiveness, something fundamental about why Germany had lost and why America had triumphed. Speer paused thoughtfully before responding, carefully selecting his words. He explained that during the early years of the war, from 1939 through 1941, Hitler and the German High Command did not regard American industrial capacity as a significant threat. They perceived America to be weak, divided, isolationist, and still reeling economically from the Great Depression. When President Franklin Roosevelt announced in May 1940 that America would produce 60,000 aircraft by 1942 and 25,000 by 1923, along with 120,000 tanks during the same period, German military advisors dismissed these figures as mere propaganda. They considered such numbers impossible and deemed them absurd boasts intended to intimidate Germany while reassuring Britain. Hitler shared this assessment. He thought the figures were mere fantasies, a desperate attempt by a struggling nation to appear formidable. However, those numbers weren't exaggerated at all, they were understatements. Upon assuming control of the armaments ministry in February 1942, Speer received intelligence reports from Berlin indicating that American production output was vastly surpassing anything Germany could achieve. He demanded comprehensive analysis. What exactly were the Americans manufacturing? How many units? And how swiftly could Germany match such prodigious rates? The responses he got were both astonishing and alarming. In 1941, the United States had churned out around 19,000 combat aircraft. This number surged to approximately 48,000 in 1942, then skyrocketed to roughly 86,000 in 1943, and finally peaked about 96,000 in 1944. These statistics referred solely to combat aircraft, excluding trainers, transports, and other non-combat types. Speer fell silent for a moment, allowing the implications of these figures to sink in. Nitser waited it expectantly, sensing that something significant was about to be revealed. Then Speer uttered words that would forever remain etched in Nitzer's memory. Upon finally seeing the full scope of American production data late in 1943, he realized with unequivocal certainty that Germany had already been defeated. It wasn't due to any singular battle or campaign, nor was it a result of German strategic blunders or tactical missteps. Rather, it was because Germany's industrial capacity paled in comparison to America's overwhelming material superiority. There wasn't any scenario, strategy, wonder weapon, or tactical genius that could alter the overwhelming disparity in industrial output. The war's conclusion was inevitable. Germany would continue to fight due to an inability to contemplate surrender and Hitler's refusal to acknowledge reality, but the outcome had already been sealed by unalterable figures. Nitser requested further specifics, which Speer provided with meticulous detail, akin to an accountant reciting a financial statement. From 1941 to 1945, American aircraft production surpassed 300,000 planes, while Germany managed approximately 19,000. In terms of tanks and self-propelled guns, the United States produced over 88,000 units compared to Germany's roughly 49,000. The US constructed around 2,700 major naval vessels, including aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines, whereas Germany built fewer than 100 such ships. However, it wasn't merely the sheer volume that dictated the outcome. The rapid pace of production was equally decisive. American factories churned out finished weapons at an astonishing rate. Shipyards were constructing Liberty ships, 10,000-ton cargo vessels, at a speed surpassing that at which German U-boats could sink them. During 1942 and 1943, U-boats sank Allied merchant ships at rates that should have crippled Britain's supply lines. Yet American shipyards were producing replacement vessels faster than the submarines could destroy them. By autumn 1943, all Allied shipping losses since the war's beginning in 1939 had been replaced. The Atlantic was no longer a perilous graveyard for Allied ships. It became a thoroughfare for America's industrial output flowing to Europe. At Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant in Michigan, B-24 Liberator heavy bombers were produced at an astounding rate of one complete aircraft every 63 minutes. A single bomber comprising over 1.5 million individual components rolled off the assembly line hourly around the clock from a factory churning out one of the most intricate weapon systems in America's arsenal with unparalleled efficiency akin to Ford's automotive production lines. In contrast, Germany had no comparable facility. Their aircraft manufacturing relied heavily on skilled artisans meticulously assembling parts while prioritizing quality. Meanwhile, American factories leveraged mass production methods, interchangeable components, and assembly line procedures honed within the automobile industry. When car manufacturers shifted their operations toward wartime production, they brought this expertise with them. Chrysler fabricated aircraft fuselages, General Motors manufactured airplane engines, guns, trucks, and tanks, while Packard produced Rolls-Royce engines for the British Royal Air Force. Ford's contribution spanned from jeeps to bombers. Speer attempted to restructure German industry following American mass production principles. He simplified tank and aircraft designs, curtailed the simultaneous production of multiple models, advocated for standardization and interchangeable parts, and made significant strides in boosting productivity. Speer managed to triple German output under his guidance. However, every advancement was rendered meaningless as American production surged by an even greater absolute amount. In 1944 alone, the United States churned out 96,000 aircraft, whereas Germany's highest annual figure stood at just 39,000, yielding a ratio worse than 2:1 for aircraft alone. This disparity was mirrored or exceeded across every other category of military production. There was another critical factor that Speer admitted he did not fully grasp until it was too late to make any meaningful difference. The United States was not merely manufacturing weapons for its own use. Under the Lend-Lease Act approved by Congress in March 1941, U.S. factories supplied military equipment to Britain, the Soviet Union, China, Free France, and other nations combating the Axis powers. American industries equipped British troops, fed Soviet armies, and transported Chinese forces. By 1944, approximately two-thirds of all Allied military hardware utilized during the war was produced in American plants. Although Britain possessed significant industrial might and the Soviet Union had moved entire factories beyond the Ural Mountains out of range of German bombers, generating vast amounts of T-34 tanks and Il-2 Sturmovik ground attack aircraft, American output still surpassed both combined. Simultaneously, America raised an army of over 12 million soldiers, maintained a two-ocean navy engaged against Germany in the Atlantic and Japan in the Pacific, executed strategic bombing campaigns on both fronts, prepared the largest amphibious invasion force for D-Day in Normandy, and somehow managed to increase civilian consumption at home. The U.S. gross national product by 52% between 1939 and 1944. The war did not impoverish America, but rather enriched it. American factories churned out military supplies at astonishing rates, while citizens purchased more consumer goods than ever before. Speer informed Nitser that this was precisely what German intelligence had underestimated in 1939 when assessing whether the United States would significantly impact the conflict. Despite observing American isolationism, political divisions, and lingering economic issues from the Great Depression, German analysts concluded that the US would not be a major player. Even after Pearl Harbor and Hitler's declaration of war on America in December 1941, German leadership believed Japan would divert American attention to the Pacific theater. They were incorrect. The United States fought a global two-front war against both adversaries simultaneously and ultimately overwhelmed them. Nitser asked when German leaders realized the true extent of American production capabilities. Speer replied that it became evident by mid-1943. That marked the turning point across all fronts simultaneously. In the Atlantic, German U-boats were being dispatched faster than they could be constructed. The construction of submarines had been prioritized, yet American destroyers and aircraft equipped with advanced radar and sonar technology were effectively targeting the U-boats, while American shipyards were producing 2 new merchant vessels for every one that was sunk. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union leveraged American trucks, aircraft, and supplies transported through Murmansk and Persia to sustain relentless offensives that propelled German forces steadily westward. In North Africa, Operation Torch saw American forces land with overwhelming material superiority, squeezing German and Italian forces between advancing American armies from the west and British troops from the east. In the Pacific, the rapid production of American carriers rendered Japan's navy weaker each month as Japanese carrier units were systematically dismantled. Over Germany, formations of American bombers grew more numerous every week. The 8th Air Force in England and the 15th Air Force in Italy dispatched hundreds of heavy bombers escorted by long-range fighters to strike targets during daylight hours. Despite the German Luftwaffe's attempts to halt them, with high fighter production rates and initially skilled pilots, new aircraft like the MiG-2 jet fighter demonstrated technological superiority over Allied planes. However, fuel shortages prevented these advanced jets from being flown in sufficient numbers. Even when fuel was available, American numerical superiority overwhelmed any resistance. For each German fighter lost, multiple replacement aircraft were produced by the Allies. Germany's inability to train new pilots due to a lack of fuel exacerbated this problem. By 1945, Luftwaffe squadrons sent up inexperienced pilots with fewer than 50 hours of flight time against American and British veterans boasting hundreds of combat hours. These encounters became one-sided massacres rather than battles. Around late 1943, Speer considered approaching Hitler with the truth that Germany's victory was no longer attainable. The American manufacturing output rendered victory an impossibility for Germany. It was crucial that negotiations be initiated while Germany still possessed leverage and control over substantial territories before its complete collapse became inevitable. However, Speer lacked the courage to voice these concerns openly. Hitler remained steadfast in his belief in secret wonder weapons that would turn the tide of war. The V-1 flying bomb, the V-2 ballistic missile, advanced jet fighters, and new submarine designs were all part of this delusion, none of which could salvage Germany's dire situation when Allied production far outpaced their capabilities by a factor of 10. Speer kept these truths to himself while maintaining operations in the factories. Soldiers continued to perish for a lost cause. On May 20th, Nitser questioned Speer regarding Hitler's Nero decree from March 1945, which mandated the destruction of all industrial facilities and infrastructure upon Germany's imminent defeat. This order aimed to leave nothing valuable behind for the advancing Allied forces. Despite this directive, Speer claimed he disobeyed it out of loyalty to the German people and the nation's future. He reportedly sabotaged the decree's enforcement, safeguarding vital factories and bridges from demolition in an effort to preserve what remained of Germany's industrial capacity for post-war recovery. This account painted Speer as a humanitarian who had distanced himself from Hitler at war's end. While its veracity was questionable, it served him well during his trial by presenting him as someone distinct from the fanatical ideologues around Hitler. On May 21st, Nitser received a message from his military liaison indicating that American forces planned to arrest Speer and other members of the Flimberg government on May 23rd. They were to be turned over to Allied forces for prosecution related to war crimes. With only 2 days left, Nitser had a chance to ask Speer about Hitler's last days in the Berlin bunker. On April 23rd, 1945, Speer visited Hitler and was one of the final individuals to see him alive. He described Hitler as an emotionally and physically broken man, deliriously ranting about perceived betrayals, issuing impractical orders to forces that no longer existed, and firmly believing his willpower could secure victory against all odds. Hitler maintained until the end that Germany's spirit would triumph over material shortages, asserting that determination, courage, and ideological zeal alone could overcome American bombers and Soviet tanks. Speer termed this conviction madness, pointing out that sheer resolve cannot stop bombs or manufacture fuel and tanks. True to predictions, British and American military police boarded the ship Patria on May 23, arresting Speer and other members of the Flimberg government during a fake negotiation meeting. Tanks surrounded Gluxburg Castle, and armed troops entered Speer's quarters to inform him he was being detained. Speer reportedly stated, "So now it is over. That was merely an opera all along." He then underwent a series of transfers through various detention centers before arriving at Nuremberg for trial by the International Military Tribunal alongside 23 other senior Nazi leaders. Nitser and Galbraith continued their work, compiling their findings into detailed reports. The Strategic Bombing Survey released its comprehensive findings in September 1945, consisting of over 200 volumes dedicated to the European theater alone. The report's key conclusions were unequivocal: strategic bombing played a crucial role in defeating Germany, though not in the manner anticipated by pre-war air power theorists. Attacks on German civilian morale largely fell short of their intended impact. Civilians demonstrated remarkable resilience despite extensive damage to cities and severe shortages of food and shelter. Factories continued to function even as workers faced the destruction of their homes and endured numerous hardships. Targeted strikes against ball bearings, aircraft factories, and other precision objectives yielded limited success. Germany managed to compensate for these losses by dispersing operations, creating redundancies, and finding substitutes. However, the campaign against oil production was highly effective. The systematic destruction of synthetic fuel plants from May 1944 onward severely impaired the German military's capabilities, reducing its effectiveness by roughly 80% during the final months of the war. Without sufficient fuel supplies, tanks and aircraft became useless metal as they could not be moved or operated effectively. The survey estimated the oil campaign had shortened the duration of the European conflict by several months, saved countless Allied lives, and demonstrated the decisive impact of strategic bombing when properly targeted. Following these lessons, Nitser was reassigned to the Pacific Strategic Bombing Survey Team in July 1945. He arrived in Nagasaki in September, shortly after atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The devastation he witnessed there exceeded anything that conventional bombs could achieve, with ruins making Berlin appear relatively unscathed by comparison. He spoke with survivors who recounted experiences no person should ever endure. The research findings regarding the Pacific Theater ultimately contended that Japan was on the brink of surrender even before the atomic bombs were dropped. mainly because its merchant fleet had been decimated and supply lines from occupied territories severed. Just as Germany's collapse was precipitated by a lack of fuel, Japan's downfall was exacerbated by the absence of raw materials essential for industry. Although the mechanisms differed, the underlying principle remained the same: modern industrialized warfare cannot be sustained without resources which an adversary with superior naval and air forces can sever. His work influenced American defense policies for decades and informed nearly every presidential administration from Truman to Reagan. He played a pivotal role in drafting the Marshall Plan, which facilitated Western Europe's reconstruction. Additionally, he was the primary author of NSC 68, a cornerstone document in Cold War containment strategy. He also negotiated arms control agreements with the Soviet Union and advised presidents on nuclear policy. Over 4 decades, he occupied high-ranking positions within American national security decision-making circles. Yet, he never forgot what Speer revealed to him in May 1945, that industrial powers ultimately win modern wars by having greater productive capacity. Material superiority, when overwhelming enough, often dictates outcomes more reliably than strategy, tactics, or bravery. America's unmatched ability to outproduce any potential rival was its most significant strategic asset. Albert Speer was convicted at Nuremberg of war crimes and crimes against humanity, primarily due to his use of slave labor in armaments factories. He received a 20-year prison sentence at Spandau prison. The tribunal acknowledged his efforts to undermine Hitler's scorched earth policy and recognized that he was one of the few Nazi leaders willing to take personal responsibility for the regime's actions. Though this responsibility was circumspectly limited to avoid acknowledging knowledge of the Holocaust, he served his full term without parole and was released on October 1, 1966. He authored 2 memoirs that reached international bestseller status, preserving his image as a non-political technocrat who had been captivated by Hitler's charisma but retained his basic decency throughout. This portrayal, referred to as the Speer myth, dominated historical accounts for many years. It wasn't until the 1980s and 1990s, when historians gained access to documents Speer had concealed, that the full extent of the truth came to light. He possessed extensive knowledge about the Holocaust and personally expanded Auschwitz. He was fully aware of what was happening to Jewish workers in his factories. His entire post-war narrative was a meticulously crafted lie aimed at avoiding the death penalty and rehabilitating his reputation. However, in May 1945, Nitser was unaware of these facts. He knew only that Speer had provided crucial information for the Strategic Bombing Survey. Speer passed away in London on September 1, 1981, aged 76, while visiting the United Kingdom. His death prompted obituaries describing him as a good Nazi, someone who accepted responsibility and was portrayed as an architect who became a reluctant war criminal. These obituaries infuriated Holocaust survivors and historians who knew better. Nitser died on October 19, 2004, aged 97. His New York Times obituary highlighted his role in shaping American Cold War strategy over 5 decades, mentioning the Strategic Bombing Survey in a single paragraph without reference to what Speer had disclosed about surpassing German production capabilities. The survey's reports remain archived and studied occasionally by military historians and defense analysts. Insights on oil targeting influenced air campaign planning in subsequent conflicts, although commanders frequently ignored lessons regarding ineffective tactics. During the Vietnam War, American bombers repeated many of the same errors from World War II by focusing on infrastructure and morale instead of targeting resources that could not be replaced. In contrast, the 1991 Gulf War saw planners adhering to principles derived from the Strategic Bombing Survey's findings. By concentrating on Iraqi oil production, electrical generation, and transportation networks while avoiding indiscriminate city bombing, the campaign achieved its objectives, and military historians credited this success to a careful analysis of survey results. Contemporary strategic thinkers continue to grapple with the factors that led to Germany's defeat during World War II. Was it the relentless pressure exerted by Soviet forces on the Eastern Front, the devastation caused by Allied bombing campaigns, Hitler's poor strategic decisions, or the critical intelligence edge gained from cracking German codes? Each of these elements played a role, but according to an account shared by General Speer with Paul Nitser in May 1945, there was one decisive factor. American industrial output outstripped Germany's at ratios that made victory for Germany impossible. In aircraft production alone, the ratio was 2-1, tanks were nearly 2-1, and naval vessels exceeded German capabilities by a margin of 10-1 or more. Additionally, the United States enjoyed overwhelming superiority in trucks, artillery, ammunition, and every other category of military equipment. The heart of Europe's manufacturing industry lay in the rural industrial regions, where German engineering was renowned for its excellence. Skilled and disciplined workers produced innovative technologies such as jet fighters and ballistic missiles. However, none of these achievements could counter an opponent capable of producing 5 fighters for every one Germany manufactured, replacing every sunken cargo ship with 2 new vessels, or landing 1 million troops on enemy shores with comprehensive logistical support due to the industrial base's ability to sustain constant production. Paul Nitser delivered this revelation from Gluxburg Castle in May 1945. It was not merely about the effectiveness of strategic bombing when targeting oil supplies, though that was tactically significant. The broader lesson was that industrial capacity serves as the bedrock of military strength in modern warfare. America had demonstrated a level of economic power unmatched by any rival without transforming their entire economic system fundamentally. Stalin understood this principle well and initiated an expansive post-war industrial build-up aimed at matching American productive capacity. This understanding also influenced the nuclear arms race, where nations sought to develop weapons that could offset numerical disadvantages if they couldn't match US conventional production levels. The Soviet Union's industrial expansion in the 1950s and 60s was an attempt to create a robust manufacturing base capable of sustaining conflict with the United States. Ultimately, however, it failed, leading to the collapse of the Soviet economy in 1991, unable to sustain both military spending and civilian living standards. China drew a distinct conclusion from analyzing World War II production data. Rather than attempting to outstrip America through rigid communist economic planning, China positioned itself within global trade networks, lured foreign investment, and developed its manufacturing sector by serving as the world's workshop. This approach enabled the country to use the resultant economic growth to fund military modernization. By 2020, Chinese industrial output had surpassed American production in numerous sectors. Whether this will translate into a strategic military advantage remains unclear. However, Chinese strategists studied the Strategic Bombing Survey and understood Speer's insights conveyed to Nitser. Wars between industrial nations are won by the side that can sustain production longer, replace losses faster, and deliver overwhelming material superiority. The core findings of the Strategic Bombing Survey remain pertinent: target resources that cannot be replenished. Recognize that civilian morale is more resilient than pre-war theorists anticipated. Acknowledge that industrial dispersion and redundancy can withstand even intense bombing campaigns. Ultimately, modern warfare is a contest of industrial capacity. The side with more factories, resources, workers, and superior production systems will prevail if other factors are roughly equal. This was what Nitser learned during 7 days of interrogation in May 1945. Germany could not win because America's material superiority was mathematically unassailable. Speer had been aware of this since late 1943. He knew that halting production would lead to immediate collapse. But he continued, and when he shared this knowledge with Nitser, it influenced 4 decades of American defense policy. If you found this story compelling, please like the video as it helps others discover these crucial chapters of World War II history. Subscribe to stay connected with untold stories from the war. Each reveals something about how the modern world was shaped. Drop a note in the comments section to let us know your location. Our audience spans history buffs, military veterans, and learners across all continents. Thanks for joining us and contributing to preserving these narratives.